Boredom, in Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, was not a minor annoyance. It was a central manifestation of human suffering. He believed that our existence swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. When we are striving for something, we suffer through lack. But when all needs are met, we suffer through the emptiness of fulfillment. And this is where boredom arises, not as a lack of external stimulation, but as an unmasking of inner poverty. The presence of a boring person confronts us with this truth. We are not irritated by their slowness or predictability per se, but by the echo they awaken within us, the terrifying suspicion that life, stripped of noise and novelty, might be hollow. The boring person becomes a psychological mirror, reflecting not their own inadequacy, but the possibility of our own unexamined existence. And our reaction, discomfort, impatience, even contempt, is not a rational judgment, but an emotional recoil from that reflection. Schopenhauer saw boredom as a spiritual X-ray, exposing the soul's lack of content. The truly interesting person, in contrast, is not one who entertains us constantly, but one who has cultivated an interior world, rich with thoughts, contradictions, passions, and metaphysical unrest. When we encounter someone who seems dull, we instinctively perceive the absence of that inner life. And what disturbs us is not merely the person before us, but the realization that such emptiness is possible, and may be closer to us than we'd like to admit. The boring individual, in Schopenhauerian terms, isn't just bland, they are hollow. And this hollowness is contagious in a symbolic way. It pulls us toward the void, reminding us of the hours we've wasted, the questions we've ignored, the creativity we've abandoned. Our mind, ever afraid of silence and stillness, revolts at the sight of such stagnation. This aversion, then, is a form of self-defense. The mind, designed by nature to seek meaning and tension, feels threatened by what doesn't vibrate, what doesn't seek or suffer. Boredom isn't passive, it's aggressive in its revelation. It tells us, here lies a life that is not being lived. Schopenhauer would argue that those who bore us activate a deeper dread, the dread of becoming like them, of waking up one day and realizing that our passions were replaced by routines, that our wonder faded into scrolling, and that our creativity became a background process. And so we project this horror outward. We say, that person is boring, but what we mean is, I fear the deadness they represent. We don't despise dullness. We despise what dullness reveals about the human condition and about ourselves if we stop paying attention. Modern culture, in many ways, has tried to inoculate us against Schopenhauer's diagnosis. We drown boredom in screens, dopamine loops, and curated experiences. But when we meet someone who doesn't participate in this frantic dance, who is quiet, slow, unremarkable, we feel, again, the pulse of the existential vacuum. The boring person becomes a rupture in our illusion. In them, time stretches out, unfilled. And that is unbearable. Schopenhauer believed that those who suffer from boredom suffer not from a lack of things to do, but from a lack of things to be. And so our irritation with the boring is, perhaps, a hidden grief for the parts of ourselves that are equally unformed, equally unlit. We hate what we do not want to become. The mind, when faced with emptiness in another, instinctively recoils because it sees its own potential for hollowness staring back. Søren Kierkegaard believed that most people live in a state of quiet despair, not because they are unhappy in the conventional sense, but because they have never truly become themselves. They move through life wearing masks, performing roles, and avoiding the existential responsibility of defining who they are. In this view, the boring person is not merely lacking charisma. They are, more profoundly, someone who has not yet engaged in the painful task of becoming. What disturbs us about them is not their behavior, but their absence of contradiction, struggle, and transformation. There is no tension in their voice, no uncertainty in their posture, no urgency in their speech. It's as if they've settled into a version of life that demands nothing from them. Kierkegaard saw this as the most tragic form of despair, not the loud, dramatic kind, but the comfortable, quiet kind, the life lived without ever truly asking why. Our minds, attuned to narrative, to drama, to risk and revelation, instinctively reject the stillness of a person who has never collided with themselves. When we interact with someone who seems boring, what we're really experiencing is an absence of existential fire. There's no sign of the inward journey, no scars from battles between the self and the world. And this absence makes us restless, because it breaks the silent contract we make in every meaningful interaction, that we will both bring some form of soul to the table. Kierkegaard believed that anxiety and despair were essential to the formation of the self. A person who lacks both is not more peaceful. They are more disconnected. They are operating on autopilot. And our mind, even if unconsciously, senses this. It interprets their stillness not as calm, but as resignation. Not as peace, but as retreat. And the rejection we feel isn't personal. It's existential. We are turning away from the non-self. There is something unnerving about encountering someone who seems untouched by existential tension. Kierkegaard called it inauthenticity, a mode of being where a person avoids becoming by immersing themselves in the trivial. They talk, but say nothing. They act, but never decide. They live, but never risk. And it's precisely this void that makes them intolerable to us, because we realize, in their presence, how easy it is to survive without ever truly living. They become a symbol of surrender, a reminder that it's possible to drift through life without ever diving into its depths. This is why boredom offends us so deeply. It's not a lack of entertainment. It's a perceived refusal to suffer meaningfully. The boring person hasn't merely failed to impress us. They've failed to struggle. And in a world where identity must be carved out through pain, uncertainty, and contradiction, that failure feels like an existential betrayal. In this light, our aversion to boredom becomes a kind of moral instinct, a revolt against spiritual inertia. Kierkegaard would argue that our disdain for the boring is actually a longing for depth, even in others. We want to see signs of life behind the eyes, a spark of irony, a hidden grief, a confession of doubt. When these things are absent, we don't just lose interest, we feel abandoned. Because human connection, at its most honest, depends on shared vulnerability. And the boring person, in their polished banality, denies us that. They are, in a way, invulnerable, but only because they are not fully present. They are a mask without a face. And so we retreat, not out of cruelty, but because there is nothing there to meet us. What we call boredom, then, might simply be the despair of finding no one home on the other side of the conversation. A despair Kierkegaard warned us was more common and more dangerous than we dare to admit. Blaise Pascal once wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. It wasn't a poetic exaggeration. It was a diagnosis. To Pascal, silence wasn't peace. It was confrontation. In the absence of distractions, the soul is forced to face itself. And what it often finds is not clarity, but chaos. Unresolved fears, unprocessed griefs, the staggering weight of mortality. The boring person, then, becomes unbearable not because they're quiet or uninteresting, but because they represent this silence in human form. They are not stimulating. They do not distract us. They don't pull us out of ourselves. Instead, they drop us back into that still room, into the very solitude we try to escape through noise, entertainment, and endless motion. Our rejection of them, therefore, is not really personal. It's metaphysical. We're not annoyed. They're just dangerous, because they leave us alone with our thoughts. What we often call boring is simply someone who refuses or fails to protect us from ourselves. Most people, whether consciously or not, function as buffers against the void. They fill time, They offer reactions, stories, sensations. They help us forget. But the boring person disrupts this arrangement. In their presence, we become aware of time again, of our own restlessness, of the absurd need to be entertained constantly. This is the terror Pascal was speaking of, the unbearable awareness that beneath all our busyness, we remain fundamentally unsettled. The boring individual doesn't cover that truth. They amplify it. Their stillness becomes a mirror, and suddenly, we are faced with the depth of our dependence on distraction. That's why our response to boredom is so visceral. It's not boredom, it's dread. A dread we don't fully understand, so we assign it to the other. They're boring. But the discomfort originates within. Pascal understood the human tendency to flee inward discomfort by running outward. Parties, work, travel, ambition, all can become sophisticated forms of avoidance. When we are left with nothing but our own company, the silence reveals not peace, but vacancy. And so, when someone fails to stimulate us, they accidentally reintroduce us to that original silence. We turn on them as though they're the cause, but they're just the trigger. We expect people to perform the role of distractions, to be interesting, funny, intense. But the person who doesn't play along, a quiet coworker, a slow conversationalist, a friend who doesn't spark joy, awakens a primal unease. We don't dislike them. We dislike what they represent, the failure of distraction. They are the embodied silence Pascal warned us about. And so our irritation isn't mere impatience. It's psychological resistance to the horror of stillness. In a way, boredom is not about the person in front of us at all. It's about the silence they fail to keep away. Pascal believed that the fear of being alone with oneself was the root of nearly all human folly. War, addiction, superficial relationships, they all stem from the same refusal to confront the self in silence. And when a person doesn't provide us with relief from that confrontation, we reject them. We label them boring as if they were lacking, but in truth, they're simply not offering us an escape. This makes them dangerous, not in the moral sense, but in the existential one. They force us to feel time again. They remind us that there is a clock ticking behind every conversation, and that most of us are trying to run out the time rather than live it. That is the unbearable truth, and that is why our minds recoil, not from dullness, but from the silent mirror of our own evasion. To Friedrich Nietzsche, the greatest crime was not evil, it was mediocrity. A life without fire, without struggle, without the pursuit of greatness was, for him, a wasted existence. In this light, boredom is not just a lack of stimulation, it is a symptom of spiritual decay. The boring person, in Nietzschean terms, is someone who has ceased to strive. They are not dangerous because they're dull. They are dangerous because they embody surrender. They have no edge, no friction, no force pulling them toward transformation. And when we encounter such a person, our mind doesn't simply lose interest. It resists them. It rebels. Because deep down, we know that the life Nietzsche wanted us to live, the life of intensity, of will, of becoming, is incompatible with passivity. Boredom, then, is not benign. It is the scent of decay. It tells us that somewhere, someone has stopped growing. Nietzsche's ideal was the Übermensch, the one who creates values, who endures suffering, who dances on the edge of chaos with a grin. In contrast, the boring person is the flattening of that vision. They have no rhythm in their thinking, no danger in their words. They are careful, measured, docile, domesticated. And that's precisely why we react with such subtle hostility. Because they don't just bore us. They remind us of a world where conformity triumphed over courage, where safety replaced adventure, where the question of who am I becoming was exchanged for how do I fit in? Nietzsche saw this as spiritual death, not sudden, not loud, but slow and comfortable. A life of quiet decay dressed up in politeness. And when we sense that in someone, even if we can't articulate it, something inside us shuts down, not out of superiority, but out of refusal. We cannot commune with what refuses to burn. There is a violence in Nietzsche's philosophy, not literal, but existential. He believed that life demanded risk, confrontation, and intensity, that the soul must bleed in order to grow. So when we find ourselves face to face with a person who resists all of that, who avoids discomfort, who lives on the surface, who never offends, never leaps, never dares, we feel not only disinterest, but distrust, because they represent everything Nietzsche warned us about. The comfort of the herd, the narcotic of obedience, the slow erosion of vitality. In a world obsessed with being nice, the boring person is the ultimate product, unoffensive, neutral, and empty. And we, who carry even a flicker of Nietzsche's spirit, cannot bear it. Not because we think we are better, but because we are terrified of ending up the same. Boredom, in this sense, is not a social failure. It is a philosophical warning. Our minds, wired for challenge and transformation, instinctively push back against anything that feels like stagnation. The boring person doesn't just lack energy, they reject elevation. They've made peace with mediocrity, and that makes them unreadable to those who still fight. Nietzsche believed that suffering was necessary, that discomfort was a sign of growth, that chaos was a ladder. But the boring person avoids all three. And in doing so, they become symbols of resignation. Our rejection of them, then, is not simply emotional. It is existential. We are turning away from a version of ourselves that might one day give up, that might grow tired, play safe, and slowly dissolve into the gray fog of ordinary living. In this way, Nietzsche helps us see boredom for what it is, not just an inconvenience, but a confrontation with the slow death of the soul. And our hatred of it is, perhaps, a final act of rebellion against the silence of giving up. There is something disturbingly familiar in the people we call boring. They're not villains. They don't threaten us directly. They don't argue, disrupt, or challenge. And yet, we feel an instinctive urge to pull away from them. Why? Because somewhere in their passivity, we see a future version of ourselves, a version that stopped seeking, that conformed, that silenced its inner fire. Our aversion, then, isn't about personality traits. It's about psychological projection. We cast our own fears onto the person in front of us. Their lack of depth, ambition, or vitality activates a mirror, one that reflects not who they are, but what we might become if we stop paying attention. The boring person becomes a living warning sign. This is the cost of not choosing, not feeling, not becoming. And that reflection is unbearable. So we reject them, not because we hate them, but because we hate what they awaken in us. Each of the thinkers we've explored, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Pascal, Nietzsche, points in different directions but ends up circling the same core truth. Boredom is not a neutral state. It is a psychic alarm, a signal of absence, not just in others, but in ourselves. The people we label as boring often trigger deeper anxieties. The fear that we are wasting time, that we are not living with purpose, that the routines we inhabit are draining our soul. In their presence, we're not just annoyed, we're exposed. The way they live, or fail to, casts a silent judgment on the way we live. And it doesn't take a philosopher to feel this. We sense it in the awkward silence of shallow conversations, in the dead air of interactions that go nowhere, in the weightless presence of someone who offers nothing of themselves. They become reflections, not companions, and the image they project is too close for comfort. What makes these encounters so unbearable is that they don't stay contained in the other. They infect our inner world. After all, What if we're not as interesting as we think? What if, beneath our curated personas, we're just as disengaged? The discomfort we feel may be less about the other's emptiness and more about the suspicion that we share it. In this way, the boring person becomes not an object of ridicule, but of existential panic. We try to laugh it off or dismiss them, but what we're really doing is building distance from a threat that feels intimate. They awaken the dread that we are drifting through life, going through motions, living a story that no longer moves us. And so, boredom is redefined, not as a flaw in the other, but as a shared vulnerability, a symptom of spiritual stagnation. And our reaction, that quiet internal revolt, might be the soul's attempt to keep itself alive, to resist the slow death of meaninglessness. In the end, the hatred we feel toward boring people may not be hatred at all. It may be grief. Grief for the parts of us that are numbed, tamed, uninspired. Grief for the dreams we let die, the truths we stopped telling, the intensity we've buried under routine. The boring person just happens to be the unfortunate mirror that reflects that loss. They are not our enemy. They are our shadow. And perhaps the real challenge is not to reject them, but to listen to what their presence is telling us. Maybe it's time to reignite the questions that once kept us up at night. To feel again. To risk again. To care about something deeply enough that boredom becomes impossible. Because the opposite of boredom is not noise or entertainment. It's aliveness. And our discomfort around boring people is not a failure of empathy. It's a cry for more. A call back to the urgency of being fully, fiercely, painfully alive. Maybe what we call boredom is just a failure to resonate. A failure to feel the pulse of life in another. And maybe, more frighteningly, in ourselves. We move through the world craving stories, contradictions, sparks. Not because we're superficial, but because we're human. We want to be moved. We want to be reminded that we're still alive. And when we encounter someone who doesn't offer that, someone who stands still while everything inside us wants to run, we don't just turn away. We react. We resist. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because they've unknowingly opened a door we've worked hard to keep closed. Schopenhauer called boredom a kind of suffering. Kierkegaard saw it as despair disguised as normalcy. Pascal warned us about the terror of silence, and Nietzsche saw in it the quiet death of the soul. But maybe all of them were circling around the same simple truth. That boredom is a signal. A soft, haunting alarm telling us to wake up. Telling us that something in us has stopped dancing, stopped burning, stopped becoming. And the people we call boring, they are not the cause of this feeling. They are the mirror. The uncomfortable, necessary mirror. So before we dismiss someone for being boring, maybe we should pause and ask, what part of myself am I trying not to see? Maybe it's not about them at all. Maybe it never was. Because in the end, the war against boredom is not about entertainment. It's about meaning. And meaning doesn't come from what distracts us. It comes from what dares to wake us.